In the eternal chronicles, it is written not of the mighty, but of the believing. For what is a miracle, but faith made visible? And what is history, but the long shadow cast by those who dared to trust in the unseen? You have spent your life reading stories of the miraculous, but have you ever truly wondered why some people seem to walk in divine power while others remain spectators? There is a hidden pattern in Scripture, a golden thread that connects every impossible breakthrough. From a shepherd boy felling a giant to city walls crumbling at the sound of a trumpet, a single chapter holds the master key, and the answer is not what religious tradition has taught you. This isn't about positive thinking or wishful hope. This is about a supernatural force so real, it can literally move the hand of God. Today, we delve into one of the most misunderstood chapters in the entire Bible, a chapter that reveals how ordinary people can access extraordinary power. There were two brothers who walked toward God, each carrying an offering, but their hearts carried vastly different intentions. Cain brought forth the fruit of his labor, vegetables and grains he had meticulously cultivated and harvested from his garden. But Abel, he brought a heartbeat. He presented the finest lamb from his flock, one he had watched being born and had nurtured with his own hands. Both men had toiled under the same sun, but only one truly understood what God desired from their hearts. Abel looked at his most perfect, unblemished lamb and knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that this was what God deserved. Not the sick one that might die anyway, not the smallest one he wouldn't miss, but the absolute best of his entire flock. This single lamb represented all that was good and precious in Abel's possession. When we read Hebrews chapter 11, verse 4, we discover something astonishing about Abel's inner world. By faith Abel offered God a better sacrifice than Cain did. By faith he was commended as righteous, when God spoke well of his offerings. And by faith Abel still speaks, even though he is dead. Abel's offering wasn't just about following a religious rule or a tradition someone had taught him. His heart was wired differently from his brothers. He saw God as holy and perfect, worthy of the absolute best, never leftovers or second-class options. His sacrifice flowed from a place of genuine belief and adoration, not from a sense of duty or obligation. And when Cain's offering was rejected because of the state of his heart, Abel's was received with pleasure, because it was born of faith. This single moment established a crucial principle that would echo throughout all of history: God values the posture of our hearts far more than the performance of our hands. In a world that was growing darker and more violent by the day, one man chose a path radically different from everyone around him. His name was Enoch. He didn't just pray when trouble knocked on his door or remember God during special religious festivals. For Enoch, every single morning, as his eyes opened to a new day, he spoke with God as a friend speaks with his closest companion. Every night before he slept, they walked through the cosmos together, sharing thoughts and dreams, discussing the day's events and the possibilities of tomorrow. This was not a religious routine or an empty ritual, it was a real, living relationship with the Creator of the universe. While others chased after wealth, power, and pleasure, Enoch chased the heart of God. For 3 full centuries, a staggering 300 years, Enoch lived this incredible life of daily communion with the Almighty. And then, something happened that was completely unprecedented in human history, something that wouldn't be seen again for centuries until the time of Elijah. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 5, explains the miraculous event: by faith Enoch was taken from this life, so that he did not experience death. He could not be found, because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. On just another ordinary day, during one of their regular walks together, Enoch simply vanished. His family searched for him, his friends called out his name, but Enoch was completely gone, because God so cherished their friendship that he decided to bring Enoch directly into heaven without the man ever having to experience death. Enoch's life serves as a testament that an intimate friendship with God is not only possible, but it is the very thing God desires most from each one of us. The sun was shining brightly in a clear blue sky when God spoke to Noah about something humanity had never witnessed before: a colossal flood that would cover the entire face of the earth. Every living creature would perish, God warned him, except for those Noah saved inside an ark larger than anyone could possibly imagine. In that period of history, rain was merely a fine mist that watered the ground. No one had ever seen a destructive, deadly storm or a cataclysmic flood. The very idea of water falling from the sky in quantities sufficient to cover mountains would have sounded utterly absurd and laughable to everyone who heard Noah speak of it. But Noah believed every single word God spoke to him. Without question, without doubt, he immediately began the monumental project he had received from God. For over 100 years, longer than a modern lifetime, Noah hammered and shaped the wood, while his neighbors mocked, pointed, and joked about the crazy old man building a boat on dry land. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 7 reveals why Noah was able to labor so faithfully for so long. By faith Noah, when warned about things not yet seen, in holy fear built an ark to save his family. By his faith he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness that is in keeping with faith. Every single day for decades, Noah toiled on that massive vessel while the world laughed at him. Children probably threw stones at the strange boat, and the adults surely questioned Noah's sanity. But Noah kept working, because his trust in God's word was greater than his fear of man's opinion. When the first drops of rain began to fall from the sky, the people may have still been laughing. But as the rain continued for days, then weeks, and then for 40 full days and nights, the laughter turned to screams. The waters rose and rose until they covered every high mountain on earth, and only Noah, his family, and the animals God had instructed him to gather survived the deluge that destroyed the entire world. Abraham had built the kind of life most people spend their entire existence striving to achieve. He was living comfortably in the prosperous city of Ur, with immense wealth, loyal servants who attended to his daily needs, and complete security for his future. His business was successful, his reputation was stellar, and his family was highly respected throughout the community. Then one day, God said something that would turn every part of Abraham's comfortable life completely upside down. Leave your native country, your relatives, and your father's family, and go to the land that I will show you. There was no detailed map showing the route, no specific directions on where to go, no timeline explaining how long the journey would take, just a simple command to leave everything familiar and trust God to lead him to the destination. Most people would have spent months asking hundreds of practical questions. Where exactly are we going? How will we know when we've arrived? What will we live on during the journey? Who will buy our property? What if we can't find food or water along the way? But Abraham didn't ask any of these logical questions. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 8, reveals Abraham's incredible response. By faith Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. Abraham immediately packed up all of his belongings, his wife, his servants, his livestock, his tents, everything he owned, and started walking toward a destination he could not see. Abraham's faith wasn't blind or foolish, it was a well-founded trust in the perfect character of God. He knew God well enough to know that his promises were completely reliable, even when they seemed humanly impossible. Abraham's willingness to leave behind everything secure and familiar demonstrates that true faith requires us to surrender our comfortable plans to embrace God's perfect will, even when we can't see the full picture. Sarah was 90 years old when she overheard God make a promise that was, by every law of nature, completely impossible. Her body was decades past the age of childbearing, and her husband, Abraham, was nearly 100. To have a child at their advanced age was utterly absurd by all the medical and biological laws that govern human reproduction. For years, Sarah had dreamed of holding her own child, but those dreams had slowly faded with each passing month and year of barrenness. Now, when her body was too old to even entertain the possibility, God promised her the very thing she had long since given up hope for. But as Sarah heard God's promise of a son, something powerful and supernatural happened deep within her. She was faced with a choice that would define the rest of her life. She could focus on her age and the limitations of her body, or she could focus on the limitless power and faithfulness of God. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 11, shows us Sarah's incredible decision, and by faith even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. Sarah didn't pretend she was still young or ignore the obvious facts of her physical condition. She simply chose to believe that God's promise was infinitely more powerful than nature's limitations. Sarah judged God to be faithful. She evaluated his character and concluded that he was completely worthy of her trust, even when his promise seemed to contradict everything she could see and understand. And when the baby Isaac was finally born, Sarah's laughter of pure joy echoed through their camp, proving to everyone that absolutely nothing is too hard for the God who keeps his word. When many people hear the story of the binding of Isaac, they imagine him as a small child. But that couldn't be further from the truth. He had grown into a strong young man, surprisingly old enough to carry a heavy load of wood up a steep mountain path, and intelligent enough to notice that something very important was missing from their preparations for the sacrifice. As they climbed Mount Moriah together, Isaac's mind began to analyze the situation. They had the fire to light the offering, enough wood to burn it, and the knife Abraham would need to slaughter the animal. But as Isaac looked around carefully, he realized they had forgotten the most crucial element, the lamb itself. When Isaac asked his father about this glaring omission, Abraham's reply was simple yet profound: God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. As they continued to walk and talk, Isaac slowly began to understand something that must have sent a chill down his spine. He was the lamb his father was planning to offer. When Abraham finally bound Isaac's hands and placed him on the altar they had built together, Isaac faced the most difficult test of faith any young man could possibly imagine. He was strong enough to fight off his elderly father and fast enough to run down the mountain and escape. But Isaac didn't resist, and he didn't try to flee. Instead, he chose to completely trust both his earthly father, Abraham, and his heavenly Father, God. Isaac's faith was just as extraordinary as Abraham's. He believed that God's plan was perfect and good even when everything looked absolutely terrifying and wrong. That incredible act of trust and submission is what saved Isaac's life when God provided the ram caught in a nearby thicket. But more importantly, Isaac's willingness to surrender his own life demonstrated that true faith sometimes requires trusting God even when his plans seem to be leading to death itself. Jacob spent his entire adult life scheming, manipulating, and grasping for things that were not rightfully his. He took advantage of his twin brother Esau's hunger to trick him out of his birthright. He deceived his nearly blind father, Isaac, by pretending to be Esau to steal the blessing that belonged to his brother. He worked for his uncle Laban for years, constantly looking for ways to outsmart and get the better of him. Jacob's name literally means deceiver or supplanter, one who takes the place of another through trickery. For decades, he lived up to that name perfectly, always plotting for the next advantage, always grasping for more. But years later, as Jacob lay dying in Egypt, something unexpectedly beautiful happened to the old master of deception. Age and experience had taught him that all his scheming and grasping had never brought him the satisfaction he craved. Only the grace and blessing of God truly mattered. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 21 captures this stunning transformation. By faith Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons, and worshipped as he leaned on the top of his staff. With his last breaths and what little strength he had left, Jacob laid his weathered hands on the heads of Joseph's two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, and spoke God's promises over their futures. The man who had spent a lifetime stealing blessings from others was now freely giving them to the next generation. And as he leaned heavily on his staff, that simple piece of wood became an altar where he worshipped the God who had patiently transformed his grasping heart into a generous one. Jacob's final scene is proof that God's grace can redeem even the most broken and selfish lives, turning manipulation into worship and deception into blessing. Joseph lived the majority of his adult life in Egypt, experiencing the lowest of lows and the highest of highs anyone could possibly imagine. He arrived as a teenage slave, was falsely accused and thrown into prison, and then miraculously rose to become the second most powerful man in the most advanced nation on earth at the time. For decades, Joseph served as Pharaoh's right-hand man, managing the kingdom's resources, overseeing massive building projects, and helping Egypt become even more prosperous and influential. His family moved to Egypt during the Great Famine and became wealthy and comfortable in their new home. Egypt gave Joseph and his family everything they could possibly need: protection, prosperity, status, and peace. Most people would have come to see Egypt as their permanent home and forgotten all about the promises God had made to their ancestors. But Joseph held something deep in his heart that prosperity could never erase. As Joseph felt his life nearing its end, he remembered something crucial that his great-grandfather Abraham had taught the family many years before. This land, no matter how comfortable and prosperous it became, was never meant to be their final destination. God had promised Abraham a different land, and Joseph knew with absolute certainty that God always keeps his promises. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 22 reveals Joseph's unshakable faith in God's faithfulness. By faith Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions concerning the burial of his bones. Joseph was so completely convinced that God would one day lead his descendants out of Egypt and back to the promised land that he made his family take a solemn oath. When God finally called them to leave Egypt, they had to promise to take his bones with them. Joseph had no idea when that exodus would happen. It could have been the next year or centuries later, but he knew without a doubt that it would happen, because God had promised it. And sure enough, 400 years later, when Moses finally led the Israelites out of slavery in Egypt, they carefully carried the bones of Joseph with them, just as he had demanded. Joseph's faith bridged 4 centuries, proving that a genuine trust in God's promises can outlast empires, generations, and even death itself. Amram and Jochebed lived in a state of absolute terror under the brutal decree of Pharaoh. The king had given a cold-blooded order that every male Hebrew baby must be executed immediately upon birth. Egyptian soldiers patrolled the Hebrew communities day and night, their ears trained to catch the first cry of a newborn boy. Mothers in Goshen wept in secret agony, knowing their sons faced a certain death sentence the moment they drew their first breath. The Hebrew midwives had already begun their silent rebellion, telling Pharaoh that the Hebrew women were more vigorous than the Egyptians and gave birth before they could even arrive. But Pharaoh's new decree was even more brutal: every male Hebrew infant must be thrown into the Nile River immediately after birth. But when Jochebed gave birth to Moses, something extraordinary happened that changed the course of history. As she looked down at her tiny son in those first precious moments, she saw something that made her heart pound with hope, not paralyzing fear. This was not just another beautiful baby. This child was special, marked by God for something far greater than anyone could possibly imagine. For 3 intensely dangerous months, Amram and Jochebed hid their son, evading the death squads that roamed their community. Every cry from Moses, every tiny sound, could have brought Egyptian soldiers crashing through their door. A suspicious neighbor might have turned them in to the authorities for a handful of silver. And if they were discovered, it meant immediate death, not just for the baby, but for the entire family who had dared to defy Pharaoh's direct order. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 23 reveals their extraordinary courage in the face of overwhelming danger. By faith Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born, because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. Amram and Jochebed made a conscious choice to trust in God's protection rather than obey Pharaoh's evil command. They understood instinctively that protecting an innocent life was infinitely more important than obeying a wicked law, no matter who issued it. Their faith gave them the supernatural strength to risk absolutely everything: their own safety, the lives of their other children, and their very own lives, to save Moses from Pharaoh's murderous decree. And when Moses became too old and loud to hide any longer, they fashioned a waterproof basket and placed it on the Nile River, trusting completely that God would protect their special son. Their desperate act of defiance not only saved Moses' life, but the future of the entire Hebrew nation. Moses grew up surrounded by every luxury and privilege the ancient world could offer. As the adopted grandson of the most powerful ruler on earth, he wore the finest Egyptian linens, ate gourmet meals prepared by royal chefs, received the most advanced education available anywhere, and commanded instant respect from everyone he met. The limitless wealth and power of Egypt were at his fingertips. The royal palace was his home, with its grand columns, beautiful gardens, and servants to attend to his every need. The Egyptian nobility treated him as one of their own, and he had access to the kingdom's vast libraries, military training, and political connections that could have taken him to the very pinnacle of worldly success. But deep inside, Moses carried a heavy secret: a burden that no amount of Egyptian luxury could alleviate. He knew the truth about his real identity. He wasn't truly Egyptian royalty, he was a Hebrew, a member of the despised slave race that his adopted grandfather was systematically oppressing with ever-increasing cruelty. Every day, Moses witnessed the suffering of the Hebrew slaves under the Egyptian whip while he himself enjoyed Egyptian privilege. He saw his own people building Pharaoh's monuments with their blood, sweat, and tears while he lived in comfortable luxury. The contradiction between his comfortable life and his people's suffering created a conflict within him that grew stronger with each passing year. When Moses came of age, he faced one of the most defining choices any person could ever imagine. He could continue living as an Egyptian royal, pretending to be someone he wasn't, enjoying the fleeting pleasures and worldly success while his true people suffered and died. Or, he could embrace his true identity as a Hebrew, even if it meant giving up absolutely everything that was comfortable, familiar, and secure. Hebrews chapter 11, verses 24 to 26 show us the extraordinary choice Moses made that altered the entire trajectory of his life. By faith Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. Moses consciously and deliberately walked out of the palace and chose to suffer with the slaves rather than prosper with their oppressors. He saw clearly that the treasures of Egypt, no matter how impressive they seemed, would eventually fade and disappear, but the reward from God would last for all eternity. Moses chose his true identity over his false one, eternal values over temporary comfort, and God's approval over man's applause. The Red Sea stretched before them, a seemingly impossible barrier, its deep blue waters extending to the horizon in both directions. Behind them, the elite forces of Pharaoh were drawing closer, a thundering approach of 600 of the finest chariots, horses trained for war, and weapons designed for efficient slaughter. The 600,000 Hebrew men, plus their wives, children, and elderly relatives, a crowd of nearly 2 million people, were completely trapped between the certainty of drowning and the certainty of being massacred by Egypt's finest soldiers. There was no path around the water, no boats to ferry them across, and no time to build any kind of bridge. The people panicked completely, screaming at Moses in fear and fury for leading them into this obvious death trap. They cried out that it would have been better to remain slaves in Egypt than to die as free people in this desolate wilderness. The faith that had been growing during the 10 plagues in Egypt now crumbled under the pressure of their seemingly impossible circumstances. But Moses heard the voice of God, clear in his ear above the chaos of their fear. Following divine instructions, he raised his staff toward the impossible sea that blocked their escape. And then, something happened that had never been seen before or since in all of human history. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 29 describes the miraculous event. By faith the people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land, but when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. Throughout that long, dramatic night, God used a mighty wind as a knife to split the massive waves of the Red Sea in two, carving a perfectly dry path through the middle of the deep, with towering walls of water on either side. As the first light of dawn broke through the darkness, Moses led the way into the sea, and the entire nation of Israel, men, women, and children, followed him, walking step by step on the very ground that had been a raging deep just hours before. The towering walls of water stood firm, held back by the invisible but all-powerful hand of God. Children walked safely between water walls that soared higher than any city wall, and the elderly moved steadily without slipping on ground that was not even muddy despite the passage of millions of feet. But when Pharaoh's army tried to follow on the same path the Hebrews had taken, the towering walls of water crashed down with a thunderous roar, drowning every single Egyptian soldier. Not a single survivor was left to report back to Egypt what had happened. The same miraculous intervention that brought salvation to the Hebrews brought total destruction to the Egyptians. The same path that led to freedom for those who trusted in God's power led to death for those who trusted only in their own military might. The massive walls of Jericho had never been conquered in centuries, never breached by any army, regardless of its size, skill, or determination. These were not ordinary defensive walls that armies had learned to overcome through siege warfare. They were an architectural marvel, so thick that entire houses were built on top of them, so high they blocked out the morning sun, and so strong they could withstand any known weapon of war or engineering device. Any military expert in the ancient world would have declared that taking Jericho by conventional means was absolutely impossible. The city was perfectly positioned, well supplied, and protected by walls that seemed to reach the very heavens. But God gave Joshua a battle plan that was completely illogical by every standard of human military wisdom and strategic thinking. Instead of building siege engines, raising ladders, or carrying battering rams, the army of Israel was simply to walk around the city once a day for 6 consecutive days. On the 7th day, they were to circle the city 7 times, blow their trumpets, and shout with all their might. For 6 days, the people of Jericho watched from their walls as this strange army silently circled their city, carrying a golden box, with no apparent intent to attack. They must have laughed at what seemed to be the most absurd military strategy anyone had ever attempted. But Joshua and the people of Israel did exactly as God had instructed, even though it looked foolish to every outside observer. They had learned from their wilderness experience that God's ways often seem foolish to men, but they always accomplish His perfect will. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 30 tells us what happened on the 7th day. By faith the walls of Jericho fell, after the army had marched around them for 7 days. As the trumpets blared and the people shouted in unison, the massive, unconquerable walls collapsed into the ground in complete and total ruin. The collapse was so precise that only one small section of the wall was left standing, the section where a single scarlet cord was hanging from a window. In that house lived a woman whose fate had already chosen which side she was on in this cosmic battle. Rahab was a prostitute, a Gentile, a person who would have been considered by religious people all over Israel to be completely unworthy of God's mercy or protection. Her profession and her nationality made her doubly excluded from the covenant community God was building. But when 2 Hebrew spies came to scout Jericho in secret before the attack, Rahab made a choice that revealed the condition of her heart. She hid the spies from the king's soldiers who were hunting for them, helped them escape the city safely, and declared her complete faith in their God. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 31 shows us her extraordinary reward. By faith the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. When the walls fell and the entire city was consumed by fire, Rahab and her entire family were saved because of the scarlet cord she had hung from her window and the complete trust she had placed in the God of Israel. Her faith conquered the barriers that seemed to separate her from God's people, proving that divine grace transcends human prejudice and social boundaries. When God first called Gideon to lead Israel against the oppressive Midianite army, 32,000 men volunteered to fight alongside him. For 7 years, the Midianites had invaded Israel every harvest season, destroying their crops, stealing their livestock, and driving the Israelites to hide in caves and mountains. But God immediately told Gideon that 32,000 soldiers was far too many for the victory he was planning to give. If Israel won the battle with a large, well-equipped army, they would naturally assume that their own military strength and superior strategy had brought them the victory, instead of giving the credit and glory to God. Following God's specific instructions, Gideon first announced that anyone who was afraid or anxious about the coming battle could go home immediately. 22,000 men left that day, leaving only 10,000 soldiers in the camp. But God told Gideon that even 10,000 soldiers was still too many for his purposes. He instructed Gideon to take all the remaining men down to the water to drink and to watch carefully how each man drank. Those who knelt down and put their face directly in the water to drink were to be sent home. Only those who cupped the water in their hands and lapped it like a dog, while remaining alert to their surroundings, would be chosen for the battle. This strange test ultimately left Gideon with only 300 men against a massive enemy army that the Bible describes as being as numerous as locusts, with camels as countless as the sand on the seashore. Any experienced military commander would have called this planned battle a suicide mission, not a legitimate strategy. The mathematical odds were so overwhelming that victory seemed impossible even if the Israelite soldiers had been 10 times stronger and 10 times better equipped than their enemies. But Gideon had learned to trust God's wisdom over human military thinking. He accepted God's battle plan without question, even though it violated every principle of warfare he had ever learned. And God gave Gideon's 300 men the strangest weapons imaginable: a trumpet, an empty clay jar, and a torch hidden inside the jar. No swords, no spears, no shields, no armor, just noisemakers, pottery, and fire. In the middle of the night, while the massive Midianite army was fast asleep in their camp, Gideon divided his tiny force into 3 groups of 100 men each. They completely surrounded the enemy camp and waited in perfect silence for Gideon's signal. At the right moment, all 300 men simultaneously blew their trumpets as loudly as they could, smashed their clay jars with a tremendous crash, held up their blazing torches, and shouted at the top of their lungs, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." The sudden explosion of sound and light from all directions completely terrified the sleeping army, who thought they were being surrounded by a massive enemy force. In the darkness and confusion, they began to frantically attack one another, unable to tell friend from foe. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 32 lists Gideon as one of the heroes who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised. With only 300 men and unconventional weapons, Gideon defeated an army of tens of thousands because he trusted God's unconventional wisdom over human military strategy. When God called Barak to lead Israel's army against the seemingly invincible general Sisera and his 900 iron chariots, Barak felt completely overwhelmed by the weight of the responsibility. Iron chariots were the ancient world's equivalent of modern tanks, nearly invincible weapons of war that could crush foot soldiers with ease. Sisera's reputation as a military commander was legendary throughout the region. For 20 years, he had oppressed the Israelites with his superior technology and strategic brilliance. His iron chariots had never been defeated in battle, and his army seemed absolutely unstoppable to anyone who faced them. But Barak had a key source of strength and confidence that gave him the courage to even consider taking on this impossible mission. Deborah, a prophetess who served as both a judge and spiritual leader for Israel, could receive direct and accurate words from God. Nothing she had ever revealed through divine communication had ever proven false. Deborah's prophetic gift was recognized and respected throughout all of Israel. When she declared a word from the Lord, things always happened exactly as she had proclaimed. Her spiritual authority was unquestionable, and her connection to God's will was completely reliable. When Deborah told Barak that God was commanding him to lead 10,000 men from the tribes of Naphtali and Zebulun into battle against Sisera's army, Barak knew it was truly God's will. But he also knew his own limitations and fears. The responsibility was too great for him to bear alone. Barak responded to Deborah with complete honesty, "If you go with me, I will go, but if you don't go with me, I won't go." Some might interpret this response as weakness, cowardice, or a lack of faith in God's promise of victory. But Barak actually understood something critically important about how faith works in real life. Faith doesn't always mean being strong enough to handle every challenge on your own. Sometimes, faith means being humble enough to admit that you need the spiritual strength, wisdom, and support of others. Deborah agreed to accompany Barak to the battlefield, and together they led the army of Israel to a complete and total victory over their seemingly invincible foe. God sent a sudden torrential downpour that turned the entire battlefield into thick, sticky mud, making Sisera's iron chariots completely useless in battle. The advanced weapons that had seemed absolutely unbeatable were hopelessly bogged down in the mire. Sisera's technological advantage was completely neutralized by God's perfect timing and supernatural intervention. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 32 lists Barak as one of the heroes who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised. His victory is a powerful testament that collaborative faith can overcome personal insecurity and accomplish God's will through teamwork rather than individual heroism. Samson had systematically squandered his incredible, God-given strength on personal vendettas, selfish pleasures, and a continuous series of foolish choices that brought devastation upon himself and others. Instead of using his supernatural abilities to deliver Israel from Philistine oppression, he pursued his own desires and disregarded his sacred vow as a Nazirite. He violated his Nazirite vows by touching dead bodies, drinking wine, and finally, revealing the secret of his strength to Delilah, the woman who betrayed him to his enemies for silver. His moral failures and spiritual compromises cost him everything that made him unique: his strength, his hair, his eyes, and his freedom. During the months he spent in prison, Samson was forced to grind at a mill like an animal, while Philistine guards mocked and tormented the man who had once terrified their armies single-handedly. They celebrated their success in capturing Israel's most powerful warrior and reducing him to nothing more than a piece of entertainment for their victory celebrations. The Philistines would periodically bring Samson out to perform tricks for their amusement, laughing about how they had thoroughly humiliated the man who had killed 1,000 of their soldiers with the jawbone of a donkey. They felt completely safe now that he was blind, bald, and bound in bronze chains. But during those long, dark months in prison, a gradual change took place in Samson's heart and spirit. The pride, selfishness, and rebellion that had controlled his life slowly gave way to genuine repentance and a renewed faith in the God he had abandoned. As Samson's hair slowly began to grow back, so did his connection to the Lord who had originally chosen him for greatness. The physical symbol of his consecration was returning, but more importantly, his spiritual relationship with God was being restored through suffering and humility. On the day of a great festival celebrating their god Dagon's supposed victory over the God of Israel, the Philistines brought Samson out to perform in their largest temple before thousands of their most important leaders. They wanted to make a public spectacle of their victory over Israel's champion. As they laughed and celebrated, making speeches about their superiority, Samson quietly asked the young servant guiding him to position him between the two massive central pillars that supported the weight of the entire roof and upper levels of the structure. Then, with a final prayer of genuine faith and surrender to God's will, Samson prayed his last prayer: "Sovereign Lord, remember me. Please, God, strengthen me just once more, and let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." Hebrews chapter 11, verse 32 lists Samson as one of the heroes who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised. In his final act of faith and sacrifice, Samson placed his hands against the 2 central pillars and pushed with every ounce of strength God gave him. The entire massive temple collapsed in an instant, killing Samson and more Philistine leaders and nobles than he had defeated in his entire lifetime. He did more strategic damage to his enemies in his death than in all his previous victories combined. Jephthah had every reason to despise his own people and refuse to help them in their time of desperate need. Born to a prostitute in a society that valued family honor above almost everything else, he was rejected and shamed by his legitimate half-brothers. When he came of age, they drove him out of his father's house and inheritance, forcing him to become an outlaw in exile. Jephthah gathered a group of outcasts around him, and they survived by raiding, fighting, and living on the margins of civilized society. He developed into a skilled military leader out of necessity, learning tactics and strategy through constant warfare and survival. But when the Ammonites threatened Israel with total destruction and military conquest, the very same elders who had rejected and exiled Jephthah came to him desperately pleading for his help. They had exhausted all other options and needed his battle-hardened military skill and combat experience to save their nation from annihilation. Jephthah could have easily refused their request and left them to face destruction on their own as retribution for their previous mistreatment of him. He was under no obligation to risk his life for a people who had shown him nothing but cruelty and rejection his entire life. Yet Jephthah chose to fight for the very people who had wronged him, putting the welfare of his nation above his own personal grievances and righteous anger. Before leading the army of Israel into battle, he made a solemn vow to God that revealed both his faith and his tragic lack of wisdom. Jephthah promised that if the Lord gave him victory over the Ammonites, he would sacrifice as a burnt offering the very first thing that came out of his house to greet him upon his triumphant return. The vow showed a genuine trust in God's power, but also an incomplete understanding of what God truly desired from his people. God granted Jephthah a complete victory over the Ammonite army, delivering Israel from their oppression and securing the nation's freedom and survival. But when Jephthah returned home as a conquering hero, his own beloved daughter came running out to greet him, dancing with tambourines to celebrate his glorious success. Jephthah was overcome with grief when he realized what his vow would cost him, but he refused to break his promise to God. Despite the devastating personal cost, his daughter displayed extraordinary courage and a faith of her own, accepting her fate with dignity and asking only for 2 months to mourn her virginity with her friends before fulfilling her father's promise. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 32 lists Jephthah as one of the heroes who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised. His tragic story shows that faith does not guarantee perfect wisdom in our decisions or protect us from making costly mistakes, but God can still use our flawed commitments and imperfect understanding to accomplish His will for His people. When the prophet Samuel arrived in the hills near Bethlehem to anoint David as the future king of Israel, David was just a young shepherd boy watching over his father's sheep. But his long journey from the quiet pastures to the royal throne would be marked by incredible victories and devastating failures that would test his faith to its very core. Years later, as king, David committed a terrible sin that brought shame upon himself and disaster upon his family. He saw Bathsheba bathing and lusted after her, even though she was married to Uriah, one of his most loyal soldiers. When she became pregnant from their adulterous affair, David tried desperately to cover up his sin. He recalled Uriah from the battlefield, hoping he would sleep with his wife and assume the child was his own. When that plan failed because Uriah was too honorable to enjoy comfort while his comrades were suffering at war, David made an even more wicked choice. He sent Uriah back to the front lines with a secret order for the commanding officer to place him in the fiercest part of the battle and then withdraw, ensuring Uriah's death. David had become an adulterer and a murderer, and the consequences were devastating. His son Amnon raped his half-sister Tamar. His son Absalom murdered Amnon in revenge and later led a rebellion against David himself, forcing him to flee Jerusalem as a broken old man. Violence and betrayal plagued David's family for years as a result of his sin. And yet, despite all of these horrific moral failures, God still called David a man after his own heart. This was not because David was perfect or sinless. It was entirely because of how he responded when he was confronted with his failure. When the prophet Nathan came to him with a parable about a rich man who stole a poor man's only lamb, David was enraged by the injustice, until Nathan pointed his finger at him and said, "You are the man." David didn't make excuses, shift the blame, or try to justify his actions. Instead, he immediately fell on his face before God in genuine brokenness and cried out the desperate words we find in Psalm 51, verse 10, "Create in me a pure heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me." David's psalms reveal a man who wrestled honestly with doubt, anger, despair, and confusion, yet never fully let go of his trust in God's character and promises. When God first called Samuel's name in the darkness of the night, he was just a young boy sleeping on a mat in the house of the Lord at Shiloh. The lamp of God had not yet gone out, and Samuel was lying near the Ark of the Covenant when he heard a clear and distinct voice calling to him. He assumed it was the old priest, Eli, who needed something. Samuel immediately got up and ran to where Eli was sleeping. "Here I am, you called me," he said respectfully. But Eli told him he had not called and sent him back to bed. This happened 3 times before Eli finally realized what was happening. The Lord himself was speaking to the young boy. Eli instructed Samuel that if the voice called again, he should answer, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." When God called a 4th time, Samuel responded as instructed, and God began to tell him something that was incredibly difficult for a young boy to hear and even harder to repeat. God told Samuel that he was about to judge Eli's entire family because his sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were corrupt priests who were treating the sacrifices with contempt, sleeping with the women who served at the entrance to the tabernacle, and bringing shame upon the house of God. Even though Eli knew about their wickedness, he had not restrained them or removed them from their office. This was an incredibly difficult message for Samuel to deliver. Eli had raised him like a son, cared for him, and taught him how to serve God. But when morning came and Eli asked Samuel to tell him everything God had said, Samuel faithfully reported every single word, even though it must have broken his heart to deliver such devastating news to the man who was like a father to him. As we read in 1 Samuel, chapter 3, verse 19, "The Lord was with Samuel as he grew up, and he let none of Samuel's words fall to the ground." From that very first night, Samuel established a pattern that would define his entire ministry. He faithfully delivered every message God gave him, no matter how difficult, uncomfortable, or unpopular it was for the people who heard it. After Samuel's death, God continued to send prophets to Israel and Judah, but with each passing generation, the nations grew more and more rebellious. These brave men faced incredible persecution, rejection, and often violent death for faithfully proclaiming God's word to people who did not want to hear it. Elijah confronted the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel and saw God send down fire from heaven, but he had to flee for his life when Queen Jezebel threatened to kill him within 24 hours. He ran into the wilderness, sat down under a tree, and prayed for God to let him die, because he felt he was the only faithful person left in the entire nation. Jeremiah, known as the weeping prophet, spent decades warning Judah about the coming Babylonian invasion. For his faithfulness to God's message, he was beaten by a priest, put in stocks, thrown into a muddy cistern to sink in the mire, and constantly threatened with death. The people accused him of being a traitor because his prophecies seemed to favor their enemies. Isaiah, who served during the reigns of multiple kings and saw a vision of God's glory that overwhelmed him with his own sinfulness, was, according to ancient tradition, eventually executed by being sawn in two with a wooden saw during the reign of the evil King Manasseh, one of the most agonizing deaths imaginable. Many other prophets faced imprisonment, beatings, exile, and violent death for refusing to compromise God's message or tell the people what they wanted to hear instead of what God had actually said. They could have easily chosen to remain silent and live comfortable, safe lives, but they understood that their calling was far more important than their personal comfort and security. Hebrews chapter 11, verses 32 to 34, praise their incredible courage and faithfulness, and what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson and Jephthah, about David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword. Throughout history, some faithful believers have faced torture so severe and prolonged that death would have seemed like a welcome relief compared to their ongoing agony. Their persecutors, often sophisticated in their cruelty, offered these believers a simple and obvious escape from their suffering. All they had to do was say a few words of denial, bow down to an idol for a few seconds, or participate in some small ritual that would satisfy their tormentors and prove they had abandoned their faith. The path to freedom was intentionally made simple and accessible, requiring just a moment of compromise. But these extraordinary believers made a choice their persecutors could never comprehend. They refused every offer of relief, every chance to escape, every opportunity to end their pain, because they were looking towards something far more valuable than temporary physical relief. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 35 tells us about their incredible decision. There were others who were tortured, refusing to be released so that they might gain a better resurrection. These believers endured unimaginable physical pain and psychological torment because they believed with absolute certainty that a better resurrection was waiting for them in eternity. They consciously chose an eternal reward over present comfort, a spiritual treasure over physical relief, and heavenly glory over earthly escape. They understood that their temporary suffering, no matter how intense or prolonged, was absolutely insignificant compared to the eternal joy and glory that awaited them in the presence of God. Others throughout history faced even more brutal and violent deaths specifically because they refused to deny their faith in God. Some were stoned to death, like Stephen, who, even as the heavy rocks were crushing his bones and ending his life in agony, prayed for his murderers and asked God to forgive them. Others were executed by being sawn in two with crude instruments, a deliberately slow and torturous method designed to maximize their suffering and create terror among other believers who might be watching. Many were killed by the sword in public executions specifically designed to intimidate other faithful people and discourage them from holding to their beliefs. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 37 describes their horrific fates with stark honesty. They were put to death by stoning, they were sawn in two, they were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted and mistreated. These extreme forms of suffering and death make it clear that faith does not promise an easy life, material prosperity, or protection from physical pain and persecution. What faith does promise is the supernatural strength to endure absolutely anything for the sake of truth and righteousness. These martyrs could have easily saved their physical lives by simply saying a few words of denial or participating in a small ritual, but they consciously chose to die rather than compromise their faith in any way. Their deaths became incredibly powerful testimonies that actually inspired countless other believers to remain faithful despite facing similar persecution. Their persecutors thought they were defeating and destroying the faith by making the cost so horrifically high, but they were actually proving that true faith is stronger than death itself. Many faithful people throughout history have lost everything they owned and cherished because they refused to renounce their beliefs or compromise their commitment to God. They were systematically driven from their homes, their businesses and properties were confiscated or destroyed, and their families were often scattered to prevent them from supporting and encouraging one another. Some were forced to live like wild animals in caves and desert regions, wearing rough animal skins because they had no access to proper clothing and shelter. These believers constantly wandered from place to place, never able to establish a permanent home, because no community would accept them or allow them to settle peacefully within their borders. They lived with constant hunger, exposure to the elements, and the ever-present threat of violence from those who hunted them as actively as they would hunt a criminal. Yet they absolutely refused to compromise their faith, even though doing so would have immediately restored them to comfortable homes, a stable income, and full acceptance in their communities. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 38 says something absolutely extraordinary about these suffering saints that reveals God's true perspective on their situation: the world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and in holes in the ground. While the world saw them as worthless outcasts and dangerous troublemakers, God saw their sacrificial lives as precious, valuable, and worthy of the highest honor and respect. Not a single one of these incredible heroes of faith received the full fulfillment of everything God had promised them during their earthly lifetimes. Abraham died long before his descendants became the great nation God had promised. Moses died within sight of the promised land but was never able to enter it. David died long before the eternal kingdom was fully established. They all died while patiently waiting for the complete fulfillment of God's promises. But their patient waiting and their unwavering trust in God's perfect timing was absolutely not foolish or misplaced. Hebrews chapter 11, verses 39 and 40 explain God's magnificent plan, which was far greater than anything they could have imagined. These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us so that only together with us would they be made perfect. What God had in mind was far more glorious and comprehensive than anything any one of them could have dreamed of in their lifetime. Their individual stories and sacrifices were actually a crucial part of a much larger, cosmic plan that would span thousands of years and ultimately include people from every nation, tribe, language, and culture on earth. All of these heroes of faith who have gone before us in history now form what the Bible calls a great cloud of witnesses that surrounds us as we run our own individual race of faith. They are not just inspiring stories from ancient history or interesting examples from the past. They are actively watching and cheering us on as we face our own unique challenges, tests, and opportunities to demonstrate faith. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1 connects their powerful example directly to our present experience and daily choices. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. And let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. Their incredible legacy demonstrates that our individual journey of faith is part of something much bigger and more important than ourselves or our personal circumstances. We are not running this race of life alone. We are part of a relay race of faith that has been going on for thousands of years, with each generation faithfully passing the baton to the next generation of believers. These witnesses provide the concrete proof that faith really works, in every generation, in every culture, in every economic condition, and in every possible circumstance that humanity can face. What they accomplished by faith, we can also accomplish by the same faith. Their stories are not just meant to inspire us, they are the living proof that God's power is available to anyone who chooses to trust Him completely. So this is the full picture. Why is Hebrews 11 arguably the most important chapter in the entire Bible? From Abel's first offering to the cloud of witnesses cheering us on, we have seen how faith is the connecting thread that runs through all of human history. These are not just ancient stories. They are the blueprint for your supernatural life. Every impossible situation you face, every mountain that seems too big to move, every dream that feels out of reach, the heroes of Hebrews 11 have already shown you the way forward. Faith is your key to unlocking the power of God in your life. But here's the thing, this message only truly works when it reaches the people who need to hear it. Right now, someone in your family, your workplace, or your community is facing an impossible situation and needs to discover the power of the faith we've talked about today. And that is where you can step in. If this message has given you a fresh perspective on faith, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, so you never miss a moment as we dive deep into God's Word together. And please, don't keep this message to yourself. Share it with someone who needs to hear that their impossible situation is exactly the kind of place where God loves to show up and work a miracle. Your share could be the moment that changes someone's entire perspective on what is possible with God. Keep believing, keep trusting, and remember that you are a part of that great cloud of witnesses who are making history through faith.